is the 2024 Ontario Winter Bible School. Our speaker for the third session is Brother Nathan Bartholomew from North Battleford, Saskatchewan. His theme this week is When God Answers Job. This is his fourth class, and the subject for this class is Recognizing Sin and Identifying the Remedy. Our reading was taken from Job chapter 40. Now we'll turn it to you, Brother Nathan.
Good morning, brothers and sisters.
Good morning.
All right, so now we begin our fourth class on Job 40 and, if we're ambitious, 41 as well. Now, what we're going to look at here is, so far, we have had this background that God has built up based on the Genesis 1 account. We've seen that in Job 38, the principles of a spiritual creation. Then we looked at 39, and what were we looking at in 39? All those personality or character traits that we saw yesterday depicted by these wild animals. They are the children of pride. Now, they're mentioned here in Job chapter 40. Before we start talking about Behemoth and then Leviathan, it's really helpful for us to just remember what it was that we were talking about yesterday, because when you come to verses 11 through to 14, we've got kind of this section here in chapter 40 that really kind of paints the picture and prepares the mind for what Behemoth is and what Leviathan is, what they come to represent. Not as a literal animal, we looked at that in the evening program, what it may have been, but what they come to represent. So let's just read through that in verses 11 through to 14. It says this here. Cast abroad the rage of thy wrath, and behold everyone that is proud. All right, so all of those individuals, all those characters that we were looking at in chapter 39, God draws Job's attention to all of those individuals. The proud of 39, the children of pride, the children of Leviathan. God draws his attention to all these characters, and he says, now can you abase him? Can you humble these individuals? Verse 12, God challenges Job, and he says this, look on everyone that's proud and bring him low, and tread down the wicked in their place, as if they were a bunch of grapes, and you could throw them into a winepress, and you could tread them down and judge them. Could you actually thresh the wickedness out of man, God is saying. He challenges Job, verse 13, hide them in the dust together, and bind their faces in secret. And if you could do that to Job, then, verse 14, then will I confess unto thee that thine own right hand can save thee. The right hand of strength and dexterity. If you could actually humble the proud and thresh or judge the wicked, then I would confess to thee that in your own strength you can save yourself. But guess what, Job? You cannot save yourself. And I will give you a picture of a great big beast to depict this problem. When you come to Behemoth, verse 24 says this. Now, King James is a little bit awkward. It says, he taketh it with his eyes, his nose pierceth through snares. The margin has, at least in the Oxford, will any take him in his sight, or bore his nose with a gin? And what's the idea here? Job, can you take your own right hand and your own strength? You take your rope and you sneak up on one of these behemoths, and you take something to bore through its nose with, and a ring, and you're going to sneak up to this thing, you're going to wrestle it down, you're going to bore its nose, then you're going to put a ring in its nose, you're going to attach a rope, and you're going to lead it around and bring it into subjection with the strength of your right arm. Can you do that, Job? And Job's like, no one can do that. It's obvious. So the connection here with Behemoth is that it is this massive, powerful force that you cannot overcome in the strength of your own right hand. So, in considering that, I would suggest that Behemoth becomes a type of Job's sin in the flesh. Now, we're not talking about a moral transgression here when we're talking about sin in the flesh. Just to be clear about this, we're using a scriptural term. God uses it. That's why I use it. It's also, scripturally speaking, we would call that the diabolos, the devil. We, in Christadelphia, use the phrase human nature, or we say this is the bias to sin that we possess within each one of us. This is our misfortune that we were born with this, not actually our crime. Okay? But here's the thing. How will you ever be released from behemoth? How will you ever be released from this sin in the flesh? It is by God's hand, by His grace, by His mercy, not by our right hand. All right, so that's kind of, overall where I'm going to go with behemoth in the book of Job. I think that you can take a couple of other layers to this as well. For example, when you come down to the verse that talks about him being the chief, so that's in verse 19. In verse 19 it says that he, behemoth, is the chief of the ways of God. All right, cast your mind back through the book of Job. Where else is something or someone mentioned who is chief? Well, remember Job chapter 1, verse 3? Job was chiefest of the men of the east. So, when you come to verse 15, and God takes this great big behemoth, the chiefest of the beasts, he says, this is a perfect representation of you, Job, because you are the chiefest of the men of the east. All right? So, in verse 15, the King James says, behold now behemoth, which I made with thee. The English Standard Version has, which I made as I made you. And when you kind of tie all those things together, you go, I think there's a really strong connection being made between Job personally and this behemoth. And in a sense, you can see how that even amongst men, Job was like a behemoth. He was this king, the greatest of the men of the East. He described in some of his speeches how that when he entered a room, the room would fall silent because of the respect that they had for him. When he entered through the gates of the city, even the old men would arise in reverence to him and in honor of him. He was like a behemoth. None could approach near to him and overthrow him, except for God. Because in Job chapter 1 and 2, God draws near to him and humbles him and overthrows him. So there is that layer to this as well, where behemoth can represent Job as an individual who is chiefest amongst the men of his time. But again, going back to this idea that I first started speaking of, I don't think that this behemoth idea or principle is something that only applies to Job. Because possessed within Job, we have this problem of sin. And that's why we cannot ignore the context of verses 12 through to 14. Because what's 12 to 14 talking about? It's talking about salvation. It's talking about whether pride and wickedness can actually be crushed by man's own right hand. You see, we all possess behemoth within us. And that speaks to that human nature. All right, now on the other hand, I want to just contrast this to Leviathan. So again, we're looking at this literal creature, Leviathan. It is this, great big beast that we considered last night in our evening program. But the important part is, what does Leviathan come to represent now in the book of Job? So I would suggest that Leviathan is a type of the reprobate mind. So I'm using the word reprobate because that's what's used in Romans chapter 1 to describe an individual who is given over to serving sin. Now, this one is, I think you can connect the dots on this one fairly readily, because in Romans chapter 6, verse 12, it says this: let not sin, therefore, reign in your mortal bodies. Well, how is sin being spoken of here? Here it's being spoken of as a king. But is that speaking about human nature? Well, this verse here is putting it as a choice that you have. It's saying, let not sin, therefore, reign. You're going to have to be on guard so that it doesn't begin to reign and have dominion over you in your life. That's where sin can become a king, where it can become a Leviathan within us, is when we give ourselves over to the serving of sin. And so thus, Job 41 and verse 34, if you just cast your eye over to that passage, it says here, speaking of Leviathan, he beholdeth all things on all high things. He is a king over all the children of pride. I think that one it would be a good idea to Bible mark in Romans chapter 6 verse 12 beside Job 41 verse 34. They're very, very similar passages, aren't they? King sin. Now, I will digress slightly to it's not really a digression, it is on topic, but regarding human nature versus when we get into the state of a defiled mind and conscience. To help us understand that, sometimes examples help. Now look, we all have this human nature possessed within each one of us. The Lord Jesus Christ had that human nature, so he was tempted in all points like as we are, such as he had the lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. We see that in the temptations in the wilderness. So we know that. But think of the situation that an alcoholic gets themselves into. We'll just start with that example. So obviously we know that being given over to drunkenness is a sin according to the scriptures. Now the thing is, if you practice that sin, it becomes this raging force within you. And the struggles of an alcoholic is like trying to fight against this massive monster that you will never really be able to defeat. I know some people, through various counseling and so on and so forth, they end up overcoming their various substance addictions. Now, what's the difference between me and an alcoholic? The difference is that I haven't practiced that sin. I haven't gone down that path, that experience. I haven't gone down that experience. That's why I'm not an alcoholic. Does that alcoholic and myself, do we possess a different nature? No. We have the same lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and pride of life, but two different experiences, and it has produced a very different struggle in our lives. All right, now that one's kind of easy to understand. Now let's talk about something like covetousness. This is something that I do struggle with. Specifically in covetousness, I'm going to talk about materialism. So I have, I'm not into public confessions and all that kind of stuff, but I will admit I have struggled with covetous materialism before. Even when I was a kid, we used to get, back when you used to get flyers and stuff, you get the real estate flyer or newspaper, whatever that was, that would come out every Sunday morning. And so Sunday afternoon, what would you do after meeting? Well, you open it up. Oh, look at all these houses. And I was 15. I'm not going to be buying a house, but I wanted to look at them. And you look at these houses, this price here. Back in those days, you could buy it for $100,000. And you're like, wow, look at that. There's one for $60,000. That's a fancy one. It's $330,000. And you're going through, you're a kid, and you're looking at houses that you don't have a hope of possessing. And then in your mind, you start looking at, ooh, that's a fancy one. Ooh, I like that one. We used to do, when I was in Okanagan, we'd do the distributions where you go around doing billing, passing out the leaflets and stuff, inviting people to lectures. That, unfortunately, for me, as much as it was a good work, my mind was involved in covetousness. Because I'm walking up to all these houses, to all these neighborhoods that I've been assigned to, and I'm like, ooh, I like the landscaping on that one. Ooh, the entranceway on that one. Now I like that one. And what developed within me was a way of thinking that was geared towards covetousness and materialism, to the point where I couldn't even walk through a neighborhood without being drawn in by this materialistic way of thinking. Now, on the other hand, if you begin to overcome that, you can have another person with exactly the same nature, but who has not given themselves over to that materialism, walk through the exact same neighborhood, seeing exactly the same things, and they're not struggling with their mind being constantly drawn away in covetousness to these things. You see, our Lord Jesus Christ is the ultimate example of one who, while he possessed the same nature that we have and was tempted in all points like as we are, his experience with sin was very different because he did know sin. He never became the alcoholic. He never became the sinaholic that I have become in various aspects in my life and that you have in your life as well. So anyways, I just kind of digress to give those little examples and explanations because I think it helps us to understand we have this basic driving force, but beware, because if you give into it, you give an inch to sin, it'll take a mile, that kind of language. That's what happens when we start to develop this reprobate mind, a defiled mind and conscience. It's the Leviathanic way of thinking. All right, so let's go back to the content of Job. And I'm not sure how far we're going to get in this class. We will at least get through Behemoth, I think. So regarding Behemoth versus Leviathan, we got some comparisons and contrasts. I just want to outline just a couple of brief little points. Behemoth, like Leviathan, is uncontrollable by man. So you can't solve the problem of Behemoth that you possess within you. Okay? And Leviathan is similarly presented as being undefeatable in battle. And that's like the whole chapter is all about it. It's like the tone changes when you go from chapter 40, through to 41. The tone changes. 40, you're looking at this big, powerful beast, and it's like, wow, this thing is powerful. Watch out for this thing. But then you come to 41, and it's like battle royal has begun. The whole thing is just filled with violence. Look at the contrast between them that you have. Behemoth is a herbivore. We know that because verse 15 says that it eats grass like an ox. All right? Whereas Leviathan is presented as a carnivore in verse 14. So just a reminder, if you weren't at last night's evening program, look at verse 14. Who can open the doors of his face? His teeth are terrible round about. And you got this idea of like these great big doors of jaws, and they're lined with terrible teeth. What kind of animals have terrible teeth in their jaws? That's the carnivores, the lions, the crocodiles. Those sorts of creatures have terrible teeth. You open up a goat's mouth, a horse's mouth, a sheep's mouth. They don't really have terrible teeth. I don't want to get bitten by them, but it's not really that bad. They're not really going to maul you to death, generally speaking. At least no cases that I've heard of a sheep mauling a person to death. But on the other hand, a carnivore can. So one of them is a herbivore, one is a carnivore. Now here's the other thing. Behemoth is presented as possessing great strength. It possesses great strength. But when Leviathan is presented, he is actively using his strength for violence. So it's just a subtle difference, but it becomes a major difference in the way that they are being presented. And so there is that difference. While human nature and a reprobate mind are related, they are slightly different here. Human nature is our misfortune to possess, but a reprobate mind is a development of defiled thinking. All right, so let's actually look at the characteristics of Behemoth. Last night we were just looking at the physical characteristics in relation to things like, what kind of an animal may this Behemoth have been. But now let's look at some of the deeper qualities that we're talking about with Behemoth. I would suggest that when we go through these characteristics, we're actually having defined for us the different characteristics of human nature, something that each one of us naturally possesses. So in verse 16, for example, we're going to see lust. There's an emphasis here on the digestive and reproductive traits, so we'll get to that in a moment. In verse 17, I would suggest that there's an emphasis on strength, or a rejoicing in strength. In that verse, it emphasizes the impressive strength of the legs and tail. In verse 18, I think there's hints at the idea of a desire for dominion and to dominate. You have brass and iron being mentioned, both echoes to the armor of Goliath, that type of a man governed by sin, and also the kingdom of men is brass and iron. Verse 21, what do we have there? We have the idea of leisure. Behemoth, if you don't find him filling his belly, you're going to find him inclining towards relaxation, sleeping. And then verse 23 is going to talk about the idea of pride. He has this great confidence and this unstoppable nature. This is not a confidence based in faith, it's a confidence based in one's own strength. So I'd suggest that while we have, oftentimes we'll go to 1 John chapter 2 and verse 16 to say, well, this is what human nature is like. It's got the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Absolutely. But it's not like that's the only passage that describes human nature to us. Here's some other things. Lust, strength, dominion, leisure, pride. Those are all basic desires that stem from this nature which we possess. All right, so let's look at the first one here. In verse 16. So regarding this idea, this concept of lust, it says of Behemoth, he eateth grass as an ox. You know what? The very first thing we're going to do to introduce Behemoth to you is how he satisfies his appetite. Because if you're going to find a behemoth, and you're hunting for a behemoth, you're going to look out on the plains, and there's a chance you will find him filling his belly. It goes on to say, it says, Lo now, his strength is in his loins, and his force is in the navel of his belly. That's King James Version. If we were just to break that down a little bit, the loins, it literally just means the waist, okay? So we're not talking about like the chest, which is, you know, where you have like your respiratory system, your circulatory system are based out of. It's not the head, so this is not like, you know, this is not the neurology that's being focused on here, or the nervous system that's being focused on. It's not any of the limbs, it's this part, the abdomen. Okay, so just thinking of it just from a very simple perspective, what body systems are contained within the abdomen? Primarily your digestive system. What's the digestive system all about? It's about satisfying one's hunger so you can fuel this mortal body. Has anyone here ever done fasting, like purposely when you're not sick? Yeah? Okay, I have, simply to go through the exercise, the mental exercise of it. You know how incredibly hard it is to deny yourself to eat? There's probably a reason only one other hand went up in this room. Because we don't want to purposely put ourselves through this denial of flesh. Now, hunger in and of itself is not a sinful lust. It can lead to sin, it can lead to gluttony, but in and of itself it's not a sinful lust. So I've tried to deny myself of eating. And it is difficult. Our bodies produce, there's two different hormones involved. There's the hunger hormone, your body produces, and guess what? It actually connects to the part of the brain, the amygdala, I think is how you pronounce it, but it's the same part of the brain that's associated with the fear response. That's why you can't ignore hunger, because it associates with the feeling of panic innately within us. That's why you can't ignore it. It's so hard to ignore. On the other hand, once you start feeling full, I'm sure we've all felt that, that's just another hormone that goes on in our bodies to tell you, guess what? You better stop now. And we've probably had, experienced those feelings. Those lusts are important for survival because if there wasn't hunger, guess what? You would die because you just wouldn't eat. Most animals would all die. So anyways, I think what we can fairly say is that there's a focus with Behemoth on this idea of eating and satisfying his belly. Now, on the other hand, the word for belly, the English word for belly that's used at the end of the verse, is actually translated as the womb, almost exclusively translated as the womb. Other places, when it's not translated as the womb, it's used in the context of a seed being produced. All right, so what body system are we talking about? The reproductive system. Once again, what's critical to the reproduction of a species is lust. Because you will not have dogs producing more dogs if they do not have a basic drive or a lust to do this. So both these body systems, whether it's the digestive or the reproductive, both of them have hunger and lust is actually critical to the survival of that individual and of the species. All right, I hope I haven't digressed too much, talked too long about this. But at the end of it, Behemoth is associated with this concept of lust and fulfilling desire. Now, this we looked at last night. In verse 17, it carries with it this emphasis on strength. In verse 17, he moveth his tail like a cedar, the sinews of his stones are wrapped together. And just, the King James is a little awkward there. It shouldn't actually be stones, but rather that word for stones is actually, it's the thighs, all right? So we're talking about the sinews of the thighs, which are made up, at least in humans, they're 4 different muscles that are all tightly knit together. And as we looked at last night, it may even be that this behemoth had an additional notable sinew that attached from its thigh, its femur, back to its tail, which connected it with the moving his tail like a cedar. Anyway, so maybe you remember that from last night's evening program. But at the end of the day, what is the focus of verse 17? He is huge and he is powerful. You see, the thing with human nature is that we rejoice in strength. We either want to be the strong man, or if we know we're not the strong man, we want to hide behind a strong man. Because that is going to be a source of protection for us, to ease our fears. So humans tend to rely on human strength. Now this one here is an interesting one. I think there's definitely a connection here to what I'm going to say, but if you have more on this, or maybe corrections for me, I mean, at any point in this series, by all means, I would like to hear that, but maybe on this section, maybe you have different thoughts. But verse 18, when it describes the bones of this behemoth, how are they described? In fact, maybe we should ask ourselves, how are they not described? Why aren't they described as gold and silver or precious stones? Why is it that they are described as brass and iron? And if I was to ask you, where in the Bible do you have brass and iron appearing together? I mean, yes, it might be associated with the kingdom of men. Yeah, Daniel, chapter 4, you have that for sure. But how about Goliath? You know, this man of sin, this champion of the Philistines. He's a champion. He's the chiefest of the Philistines, and he is an individual who is governed by sin. So he's clothed with brass and iron. So those are the sorts of things that are associated with Behemoth. And this idea of dominion, you know, the dominion of the kingdom of men. Naturally, we want to dominate. That's why for the past 6,000 years, there have been wars on the face of this earth, because of this natural driver that we have to dominate. All right, now this one should be fairly obvious, I think. Is this a marker, is this a characteristic of our human nature? A desire for leisure? Well, verse 21 and 22 says this of Behemoth. He lieth under the shady trees, in the covert of the reed and fens. The shady trees cover him with their shadow, and the willows of the brook compass him about. And like we were saying earlier, if you're looking for a behemoth, where would you find him? Well, if he's not satisfying his belly, then he's probably relaxing in the shade. And I would say that the drive to relaxation, to leisure, is something that's huge within our nature. We naturally gravitate towards this. What about this one? Well, verse 23 seems to depict a characteristic of Behemoth that speaks of pride. So verse 23, it says, Behold, he drinketh up a river and hasteth not. He trusteth that he can draw up Jordan into his mouth. Let's put that in NASB, because sometimes the different translations help. It says, if a river rages, he is not alarmed. He is confident, though the Jordan rushes to his mouth. Pride and confidence, self-confidence, go hand in hand. And that is a quality of Behemoth. Full of confidence in what? In God? No. In his own strength. He could stand in the middle of a rushing river. Every other thing will be swept away, but he will not be swept away. Where is his confidence? In his strength. What does that lead to? It leads to a sense of pride. So I guess when we just kind of summarize it, what we have depicted in the characteristics of Behemoth are all these things that just seem to just connect with what we would say human nature is like. For example, verse 16 is, just to summarize, is lust. What do we see in 1 John 2, verse 16? It speaks of the lust of the eyes and the lust of the flesh. Verse 17, speaking of this idea of strength and this emphasis or possession of strength. And we are exhorted, just as an example, Proverbs 3, verse 5, to lean not on our own understanding, because that's naturally what we do. We don't naturally trust in God. We lean on our strength, on our understanding. Dominion, you know, this idea in verse 18 of dominion. I don't actually have a verse right there as being a basic driver of human nature, but I am very open if anyone wants to add to any of these verses. By all means, let me know. Verse 21, the idea of leisure. Let's just turn to Ezekiel 16. So if I was to ask, you know, what is the sin of Sodom? And I'm sure, you know, amongst the adults, many of you will be familiar with this Ezekiel 16 passage. Oftentimes we think of what Jude's commentary is, which is to do with fornication, homosexuality, that kind of a thing, which absolutely is part of that sin of Sodom. There's a few other basic things that were at the root of Sodom's sin. In Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 49 and 50, it says this: "Behold, this was the iniquity of thy sister Sodom: pride, fullness of bread, abundance of idleness was in her and her daughters. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and the needy." And then it goes on and emphasizes, "And they were haughty," and then it adds, "and committed abomination before me. Therefore I took them away, as I saw good." And the committed abomination, based on the commentary in Jude, seems to be this idea of fornication and homosexuality. But, look at the emphasis here that we have in Ezekiel 13, not only this pride that's spoken of, but also this abundance of idleness, the iniquity of Sodom. Of course, regarding this pride in verse 23, where do we see that in the Scriptures? Certainly 1 John 2, verse 16, when it speaks of the pride of life, or what we were just in Ezekiel 16. It's about pride and how they were haughty. All right, so hopefully that's helpful, but to me anyways, I look at this idea of behemoth, I see the context to behemoth that it's laid in about this idea of, can you save yourself, Job? Well, why not? Because you've got this massive problem within you that you can't put a ring in its nose and lead it about with. You need God to deliver you from that bondage of corruption. So when will that happen? When will we be delivered from behemoth? Well, as we know, that'll be at the glorification, when we are immortalized and made equal to the angels. Now then, looks like we will get into Leviathan. So let's just look at some of the things to do with Leviathan, just to establish what I was saying earlier, that it represents corrupted thinking. So just to recap then, chapter 41, I know I've said this already, but this is when a violent struggle now ensues. This is kind of like, you have the life of an individual who has now become an alcoholic. And I think that for, I don't have that much experience with alcoholics, but a little bit. And I think the way it's described is like it really is this huge battle for them to overcome. But we don't need to just pick on alcoholism. Take any one of the sins. Whether you're given over to the entertainments of this world, or perhaps if you're given over to the pursuing of that almighty dollar, or whatever it is, it can be very, very hard to extricate ourselves from it, to the point where we find ourselves daydreaming about these silly things when we could be doing something much more profitable. And that's what happens when sin ends up entering into our minds and defiling our minds. So, as we noted, he's king over all the children of pride. It speaks to one who is now dominated by sin and living under its dominion. Now, in order to really look at this, we've got to go to Romans chapters 5, 6, and 7. Because in Romans 5, 6, and 7, we went to the one verse, but I want to just touch on the significance here. So on the screen, and I don't know if you can see this at the back of the room, so I will just, I guess afterwards, you can get a copy of this if you want to. But all this is an exercise where you go through these chapters in Romans and highlight in all the ideas of kingship that's here in Romans chapters 5, 6, and 7. For example, Romans 5, verse 1. For if by one man's offense death reigned by one. So what's the connection that's being made here? You have death as if it is reigning as a king. But on the other hand, you have a contrast. Much more, they which receive abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness shall reign in life by one, Jesus Christ. And there is so much packed into these statements that are made in these verses. But you've got grace, righteousness, life through Jesus Christ, and we are able to reign in life by Jesus Christ. Okay, 5 verse 21, that as sin has reigned unto death, even so might grace reign through righteousness unto eternal life by Jesus Christ our Lord. See how it's packed? Grace, righteousness, life, Jesus Christ, who is our Lord. He's our King. So there's like a choice that we have. Who are you going to serve? Is Christ our King, or is sin our King? And that's where you come to that section that we referenced there, and we want to read through it in Romans 6 and we're going to take verse 12 through to 14. In verse 12 it says this, of Romans 6, "Let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body, that you should obey it in the lusts thereof." All right, you just stop and consider that verse, and you kind of get some important key ideas about sin. Here it is a choice. Are you going to allow it to reign? Now, if you were to allow it to reign, how would you allow it to reign? Well, the end of the verse says that you should obey it in the lusts thereof. So it's not possessing the lusts that actually makes sin a king within you. But rather, it's when you obey the lusts that now sin has become a king in your life. You just keep reading through it. Verse 13, the exhortation for us. "Neither yield ye your members as instruments of unrighteousness unto sin, but yield yourselves unto God." There's a choice. Who do you yield yourself to? Yield yourselves unto God as those that are alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness unto God. Verse 14, "For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under law, but under grace." And when we come into Christ, then we can be in grace. We can serve Christ instead of serving sin. And you just carry on through all these different passages. Verse 16, "To whom you yield yourselves servants to obey, his servants you are, to whom you obey, whether of sin to death or of obedience unto righteousness." You follow through the idea of servants, because if you have a servant, then you have some kind of a master, lord, king, or ruler over that servant. So 6 verse 17 talks about servants of sin, but verse 18 talks about servants of righteousness. Verse 19 talks about being servants to uncleanness and to iniquity unto iniquity, but then it talks about servants to righteousness unto holiness. Verse 20 talks about you were the servants of sin, but verse 22 talks about becoming servants to God. So you can't avoid, you cannot escape this idea of sin can take kingship and have dominion in our lives. But the exhortation, verse 12 to 14, don't let it become your king. Now this also brings us to another important point about sin, and that is that, okay, so if I can't have sin as my king, if I ought not to let sin be my king, well then maybe I should become the king over sin. That's not what this is saying. We do not overcome King Sin by becoming its king. Read through these passages. It says, you overcome sin by becoming the servant of Christ. That's how you avoid becoming the subject or the servant of King Sin. It is by becoming the servant of Christ. You see, if I could become the king of sin, that means that my own right hand can save me. And I have gotten dominion over sin by myself. Where did we just read about that? Job 40 and verse 14. The whole point that God has to Job is, Job, you can't save yourself. And you cannot save and change other people. All right, so that's kind of some pretty important first principle doctrines regarding sin in our life, and also the moral outcome of these things. All right, let's just go back to Leviathan here. Presented as King Sin. I think we've talked about all these things, but I just want to recap this point here. We've looked plenty at chapter 41, verse 34. He's king over all the children of pride. But just to summarize, Leviathan comes to represent sin's dominion over us when we have become reprobate in our thinking, Romans 1, verse 24 to 32, and defiled in our mind and conscience, Titus 1, verse 15. So as a result, when we come back to Job chapter 41, what God is now going to do to Job, after he's exposed the root issue, you possess the behemoth within you, as all men do, now I'm going to show you, Job, where Leviathan is in your life. Let's just think about that for a moment. where in Job chapters 3 through to 37, or if you want, even up to chapter 41, where have you seen a little bit of Leviathan in Job's life? Well, God is going to start by introducing Leviathan in this way. Does he introduce the impressive feet of Leviathan? Or is it the tail? Is it the spine? Is it the claws or the hands? Is it the chest or the belly? No. The very first thing that is presented about Behemoth, about Leviathan to Job, has to do with, if you just look at me here, this part of the body. This part right here. Right around the mouth region. Okay? So let's just read through it. It says here, verse 1 through to 3, "Canst thou draw out Leviathan with an hook?" Can you just imagine, you toss in a baited hook. What you're hoping for is that Leviathan is going to go come chomp on it. That he's going to use his mouth to grab that hook. It goes on to say, "Or his tongue with a cord which thou lettest down." Can you take the tongue, and can you take control of Leviathan's tongue, Job? The next verse, verse 2, "Canst thou put a hook into his nose, or bore his jaw through with a thorn?" So even without going to verse 3, which kind of makes it obvious, verses 1 and 2 is talking about a problem, a characteristic of Leviathan that is being manifested from this part of the body, the area where the mouth is. You see, verse 3 then goes on to make it clear. We're talking about the part that has to do with words and speech. The problem with Leviathan is, can he make supplications to thee? Nope. Will he speak soft words unto thee? Will he edify? No, Leviathan will not. Isn't that interesting? That part of the body is what's focused on to begin with when presenting Leviathan to Job. Now, do you remember back when we had a chart? I guess I don't have it on this slide here, but we had a chart of all the different speeches in the book of Job. There's 11 speeches that Job gives. In the Oxford Wide Margin Bible, that will be about 16 pages of volume of speech. And all the other friends combined is less than half the amount that Job speaks. Interesting, isn't it, that in chapter 38, verse 2, when God first thunders out of the whirlwind, what is the very first thing that he says to Job? "Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge?" Here's your problem, Job. Here's where Leviathan has caught you. It's in the words that you speak. It's in your tongue and the way you use that tongue. In chapter 40, verse 1, God says to Job, "Shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct him?" Job had thought that he could use his tongue to justify himself before the Almighty, as we saw kind of emphasized in our first class. He goes on to say, "He that reproveth God." Now's your chance, Job. Now you can answer it. Job recognizes the problem that he has. Once God exposes him for who he is, he goes, Chapter 40, verse 4, "Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer thee? I will lay my hand upon my mouth." That's where his problem was in his life. In chapter 42, verse 3, Job says, "Who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge?" He's quoting from 38, verse 2. He recognizes it's him. "Therefore have I uttered that I understood not, things too wonderful for me, which I knew not." You see, Job had a problem with the use of the tongue. So in his life, that reprobate way of thinking, the way that he was serving sin, was in the words that he spoke. Now this just shows us, and I wonder at the deceitfulness of sin, because, it's Romans 7, this idea of sin by its deceitfulness, it slew me. Or perhaps we can talk about the deceitful heart that is spoken of in Jeremiah. One of the ideas of sin is like a serpent. It lies in ambush, and oftentimes it's after the fact that you realize that you've been bitten by sin. You see, Job didn't realize his sin that he had. Remember in chapter 31, in his last speech, Job says, "I wouldn't hide my sin the way Adam hid his sin." Well, genuinely, I can only judge that Job was genuine in this. He did not intend to hide his sin, but God reveals his sin to him. Now, there's a lot of other points that are made about sin, and so we're just going to go through a few of them in the last few minutes here. And this just establishes and gets us on the right path as to how sin can operate in our life and the dangers that we're going to face. Here's some of the points that are being made as we continue on. It says, "Will he make a covenant with thee?" in verse 4. "Wilt thou take him for a servant forever?" Now, do you remember when we were in Romans chapters 5, 6, and 7, do we avoid becoming the servant of sin by becoming king over sin? No. We don't become the king of sin. We become the servants of Christ, and that is how we do not serve King Sin. And so that's what's being said here. Wilt thou take him for a servant forever? So the key, we cannot become king over sin. We're to become the servants of Christ. I think we've already kind of touched on that already in some of our comments. Let's just zoom across to some of these other verses. Just to summarize what some of these verses here are saying about Leviathan. Let's just read verses 4, 5, 6, and 7. And let's also just summarize. Okay, what are they about when we read it? Well, verse 4, you cannot make a deal with sin. Verse 5, I love this. This is wonderful if we could only remember this. You cannot play with sin or restrain it somehow and then give it to your children. Verse 6, you cannot safely use Leviathan, sin, to your advantage. Verse 7, you cannot overcome sin through sheer force. So we read through it, and again, poetic language, so you kind of got to wrap your head around it. But verse 4, will he make a covenant with thee? Wilt thou take him for a servant forever? Can you make a covenant with him? Can you cut a deal with sin? Like, okay, I will only watch movies that are of this rating. Oh, I think I just stepped on a sensitive topic, because I'm guessing that that's something that people will have different standards in their life. However, if you try to make a deal with sin, you're going to find that sin is going to end up becoming the winner. At least that's what I've found in my life. You can't really make a deal with sin. Verse 5 says here, wilt thou play with him as with a bird, or wilt thou bind him for thy maidens? In other words, could you take him and kind of like, you might take a poodle, put a little leash on it, and give it to your daughter, and your daughter can kind of, walk that little puppy around? Can you do that with Leviathan? No, you would never take this 30-foot-long crocodile, put it on a leash, and give it to your daughter. Your daughter would be gone. And we know that when we look at something like Leviathan. But what about sin? Just think about that in your own life. Is there a way in which perhaps I toy with sin? Instead of staying as far away from sin as I possibly can, I toy with it just a little bit. And so perhaps, although I know there's a lot of garbage on Netflix, perhaps I want to have a Netflix account. I toy with it. But man, if you got that account, I imagine that what's going to happen is I'm going to have a moment of weakness at some point. And at some point, I'm going to start indulging in things that I probably ought not to, that will at least be a complete waste of my time. So I realize that, again, sometimes these things are sensitive, and you're going to have to make your own decisions in your own life. But beware of this principle. Don't toy with sin. And then don't just take sin, restrain it in some way, and say, all right, there you go. Let's hand this to you, my kid. And now I've given you access to all these different things that the world likes to entertain you with. That's the warning of this verse here. You can't just restrain sin and then give it to your children and expect that they're going to survive this. Verse 6, when we read that, it says, shall the companions make a banquet of him? Shall they part him among the merchants? This is the idea where you could go, wait a second. I think that what I could do is if I could take Leviathan, if only I could overcome him, well then I could cut him up, and imagine how much money I could make selling Leviathan. Oh, the world has totally tuned into that one. And so they use sin to their advantage. And that's why when you go through all the entertainments of the world, what are you going to find? Something that appeals to sin. Even the news, brothers and sisters. Like, Okay, the news seems pretty harmless. It's not. Like, you got to discipline yourself. Spend a few minutes each day. That's okay. But the news is created by the world. These are individuals who they make it appealing. Beware of that danger. The thing is, what we want to do is we want to safely use things that cater to sin to our advantage. Verse 7, you cannot overcome it through sheer force. Look at verse 7. Canst thou fill his skin with barbed irons, or his head with fish spears? The point is that you cannot use sheer force and willpower to think, you know what? I think I'm disciplined enough in my own self-discipline that I will survive against sin. It's just not going to work in that way. All right, so I think for time's sake, we are going to end it there. And tomorrow we'll pick up, we'll finish off a few things to do with the Leviathan. And then what we want to do is we want to go back to Job 38, go back through this whole section again, but from another layer. We want to see that there's a prophecy that is here in Job 38, 39, 40, and 41. Thank you.